By now, many of you have heard of GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. Chances are that if you heard about them prior to this course, it was in the context of GM food, specifically crops like corn, soybeans, canola, and maybe papaya that are transgenic, meaning they contain DNA from another organism. This enables plants to do things like produce their own insecticides, or tolerate certain herbicides, or be resistant to viruses. So when you think about GMOs, you probably think about agricultural fields. You might also think about industrial processes and pharmaceuticals, ranging from the production of human insulin to the manufacture of COVID vaccines. But you probably don't often think about GMOs out in the wild. What does it mean when we think about releasing GMOs into shared environments, where they might spread and persist? I'm a social scientist at NC State's Genetic Engineering and Society Center, and this question really interests me. In particular, I'm curious about how the environmental movement, which has often been a strong voice against GM food, will respond to GMOs that are designed for environmental benefit. Let me give you an example. The American chestnut tree once dominated the eastern forests, representing up to 25% of all trees in the Appalachian Range. A fungal blight, accidentally introduced in the late 1800s from Asian chestnut trees imported as ornamentals, essentially wiped out this whole population. Efforts to use conventional breeding to create a blight-resistant chestnut haven't been successful, but some scientists at the State University of New York have used genetic engineering to make an American chestnut tree that withstands the blight. Here's how it works. The fungus releases an acid that kills tree tissue, which leads to the cankers that eventually strangle the tree. But the scientists figured out how to take a gene from wheat that detoxifies the acid, so the fungus doesn't damage the tree. They use the same technology that was developed for GM crops, splicing a sequence of DNA from wheat and a promoter that helps the chestnut tree express that sequence enough to counteract the fungus. With funding and support from the American Chestnut Foundation, private sources, and federal science agencies, the scientists have run field trials to test these trees and also conducted experiments to see if there might be unintended effects on wildlife or soil. Those tests have been reassuring, and the scientists submitted their GE, or genetically engineered chestnut tree, for regulatory approval. Here's where things get interesting to a social scientist like me. First of all, the GE chestnut tree is regulated by 3 different agencies. The US Department of Agriculture, or USDA, is responsible for making sure that the new GE plant doesn't represent a new plant pest. The US Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, is concerned with whether the chestnuts, which are edible as human food, are substantially different from traditional American chestnuts. And because the GE chestnut tolerates the blight by detoxifying the fungus, it's considered a pesticide, which triggers the attention of the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, which regulates all pesticides. What this means is that there will be a lot of attention paid by regulatory experts and scientists looking at various characteristics of this new tree. It will likely take several years for all of these agencies to evaluate the GE chestnut. But if they all agree, it will be deregulated, which means it can be planted anywhere in the US without a permit. But the questions we might ask go beyond the science, beyond the somewhat narrow questions asked by the USDA, EPA, and FDA. Even if we can safely restore the American chestnut tree with genetic engineering, should we? Here are 3 specific examples of issues we might consider. Number 1, unlike GM crops, GE American chestnut trees will spread and persist in unmanaged environments. Over time, they will likely be on private land, public lands, national forests and parks, and likely cross political boundaries like the US-Canadian border and sovereign territories of Native American tribes. Does our US regulatory system have the right to decide whether GE trees are allowed on Canadian soil or on Native American territories? Number 2, what do GE trees mean for wilderness areas or nature? Some people might see the return of an American chestnut to Appalachian forests as a restoration of wilderness, of wildness, because a keystone species would once again thrive in an ecosystem that was devastated by a human-introduced pathogen. Other people might see a GE tree as undermining wildness, since genetic engineering can be seen as a kind of ultimate intervention in the nature of an organism. rewriting its genetic code. People are likely to disagree whether GE trees like the American chestnut are good for the environment. Number 3, what does ecological restoration mean in the context of climate change? My former graduate student, Jessica Cavan Barnes, compared the suitability of habitat for American chestnut trees, comparing its historic range to predictions of climate models over the next century. What she found was that, at least under some scenarios, much of the suitable habitat moves north, quite far north, in fact. Even if the GE tree can fight off the fungus, it might be that the American chestnut cannot be restored to southeastern forests where it once thrived. So if we aren't restoring the American chestnut to its native range, what exactly are we doing? How we answer these questions is not just a matter of getting the science right or the facts straight. Scientific disciplines have important roles to play here, like testing for ecological impacts, predicting how the tree might spread, choosing good sites for restoration, and perhaps creating other biotech trees to counter other threats to forest health. But we also need sociologists and historians and ethicists and political scientists and anthropologists to help us wrestle with other dimensions of this emerging technology and how we make decisions that are in the public interest. If this kind of complexity interests you, you might consider learning more about NC State's undergraduate program in Science, Technology, and Society, or STS. I'm an STS scholar and the director of our undergraduate STS program within the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. We offer classes that sit at the intersection of science, technology, and society, with BS, BA, and minor degrees to offer opportunities to students from across our campus. Our curriculum helps students prepare for careers that shape the ways that science and technology can benefit our society.